Now, I admit that I have thought about Walter's work in connection with this essay only in the very most general terms. As I said to you, at one point, I thought I would use him as an example of a post-liberal preacher, but then, which I think would have been apt, but I had too many balls in the air and I only had 8,000 words to work with.
Yes.
And I thought introducing a fourth figure
Yes.
going to be too much. So,
Well, I thought it was delightful. And I do have a paragraph I want to ask you about. So these are free flowing and I enjoy these, and we kind of go where the Spirit leads us, Ellen.
okay.
And so I'll add at the beginning of this, but I'm going to introduce you now, and we'll go for about half an hour or so.
Okay, and I will introduce myself, but if I don't answer a question you think I ought to answer in terms of my introduction, ask me.
Okay, I will.
Okay.
Welcome, friends, and greetings. Welcome to this podcast entitled Imagination Restored. My guest today is Dr. Ellen Davis from Duke Divinity School. And Ellen, it's great to have you with us. Would you talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you, Conrad. It's a delight to be here. I teach at Duke University Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina. I am an Old Testament scholar, but my professorial title is Professor of Bible and Practical Theology. I'm jointly appointed then in two fields, in Bible and in the ministerial field. That was created for me at the time of my appointment 22 years ago, because I'm interested in interpreting the Bible for living communities, both Jewish and Christian. I'm an exegete. That's really where I focus my attention. My training, my doctorate is from Yale. I was a student of Brevard Childs. Mm-hmm. And as I get older, I realize how much I look like a student of Brevard Childs. My undergraduate work was at the University of California in Berkeley and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And in those contexts, I studied, my major was in comparative literature with Latin and Hebrew. And so all my life I've been looking closely at texts and paying attention to language. And that really shapes the way I read the biblical text.
And you're an eloquent and passionate preacher.
Thank you.
And if any of you have not watched or seen Ellen preach, you should do that. There are a number of videos out of her doing that. I'm interested in, you said that you become more like Childs. You're aware of that. Of course, I just finished a biography of Brueggemann, and there was some back and forth between the two of them. Can you say what that means for you to look more and more like a student of Childs?
Yes. We were very close. When I was a doctoral student, he was a wonderful mentor to me, and then that continued when I became his junior colleague at Yale Divinity School. And then beyond that, when I moved elsewhere, we remained friends to the end of his life in 2007. So it was a long friendship. And one thing that was obvious was that we had very different casts of mind. He's unquestionably, he's the most learned person I have ever known, in biblical studies, certainly. And he used to say, sort of half jokingly, "Now, Ellen, I know you're not interested in theology." And I would respond and say, I'm interested in nothing but theology. I'm just not very interested in 18th and 19th century European theology. Um, and but in fact, one way that I would say I am like him is that the text is central. I read the text theocentrically, which is to say, I read it around the character and in light of the person of God. And I read it for the sake of, as I said earlier, living communities. And we did that in different ways. I do it, as you pointed out, in no small part through preaching. That was less important in his scholarship, but he was always concerned. His whole interest in reading Old Testament, New Testament, as he called them, as scripture, was how do they function for living communities. And both of us grounded our answers to that to some extent in what we now call reception history. He called it history of interpretation. How have they been read in the past? Again, he had a vast understanding of that. I would also say that I think one of the important things that he did was to recognize that asking about how the text functions and has functioned for living communities means looking at how Jews as well as Christians have read it. That was not common in his generation of German-trained biblical scholars. My background was different, as I said. My undergraduate work, some was at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So my earliest teachers in Bible were all Jews. So that it came to me somewhat more naturally, but I see that his bringing that into the conversation is absolutely central to the way we do exegesis. I think that was something like a pioneering move when he was doing that in the early 70s.
Who were some Jewish scholars who influenced him?
The one I know most, because he spoke of him frequently, was Judah Golden, who was a colleague at Yale. And the book in which he really, Bard Childs, really brings that to the fore is his Exodus commentary, which I think is one of his greatest books. And all the way through, he's following Jewish and Christian history of interpretation. And that came out of a seminar that Judah Golden taught at Yale and Bard sat in on. So that would be probably the single most important influence on him. And of course, like many of us, he was influenced by people who were dead for centuries before he wrote. But and he was quite, and he was, I wouldn't say deeply knowledgeable in Midrashic tradition. He wasn't fluent in it, but he was conscious of it.
Ellen, I remember you saying in a previous conversation that you enjoy writing the essay in the essay mode. Is that correct? And you enjoy preaching. Is this a way of living out your commitment to this being for the living people of God? These two modes?
The essay format is, I think that comes from the way I teach. When I teach, I'm trying to bring different angles of vision to bear on a text. So normally for a given class, a given session of a class, I might assign work by 3 to 6 different people, a chapter sort of from different people, for instance. And because it's relatively rare that I assign a whole monograph by one person, unless I'm really focusing a class on the work of a particular person, and I don't often do that. So I try to write my books in the way that would be most convenient for people teaching the way that I do. And it also, I suppose, suits my frame of mind in that I'm interested in the wide take on something and sort of connecting different things. And essay, as you know, the word means SIA is to try something. And I really like trying things and seeing how, if you put different within an essay, if you put different angles of vision together, what you see.
Which brings us to your recent article that's forthcoming, Ellen, called Stretching the Literal Sense in the Pulpit, and it's about Hans Frei. And as I said to you, I went digging and found that a bit about Frei. What drew you to this, to him in particular, but also to this essay? And of course, you compare three, I think, theologians throughout this. What drew you to this particular?
It's an unusual essay for me to write. I wrote it because I was asked to present something next month, actually, at a conference for Hans Frei that will be held at Yale. This is this year is the 100th anniversary of his birth. And he was a major shaping influence in the environment in which, in a sense, I grew up as a scholar. And he was a German Jewish Christian theologian. So born in 1922, his parents had the resources to send him to England in 1934, I believe. And so he just saw as the 12-year-old the very beginnings of the violence in Germany against Jews. And I think to a great extent he struggled. I knew him latterly in his life. I was at Yale 1983 to 87. He died rather suddenly in 88. And I think at that time he was quite consciously thinking about what it meant to be a Christian theologian as a Jew.
Yeah.
Maybe a question he hadn't foregrounded as much earlier. And I knew him best. He was on my dissertation committee, but in a sense, I knew him best because we were, in most cases, the only two baptized persons who showed up at the Jewish studies lectures that were held maybe once a month or so at Yale. And so that was a kind of bond between us. I was very surprised. I'm not a Frei scholar. I would not have expected to be asked to write an essay in his honor for this occasion, but I was. And having been asked, I realized he was my teacher and I could not fail to do that. But I will admit, and I said it to Mr. Frei in his lifetime, I don't really understand anything you've written. And so he was very gracious about that. So there was no point in pretending I was a Frei scholar. But I thought about what he was trying to make us aware of, which was how drastically our view of the biblical text changed. He would date it about 1700. I dated a little bit earlier. And his perspective was our view as academic theologians, and he's right. This is why when Barchild says, I'm not interested in theology, I'm not interested in 18th and 19th German theology so much, European theology. I'm very aware of that change as it has affected the way we think about preaching, and the way we approach a text in the pulpit. And so that's what I decided I could do in response to his work.
And how has it affected preaching in the pulpit and the text?
Well, in this essay we're discussing, I draw a contrast between two deans of St. Paul's Cathedral, London, in the 17th century. John Donne, best known to us as a poet. He expected to be best known as a preacher. And we have 10 volumes of his sermons. And Donne died in 1631. And Donne preaches wholly from inside the biblical story. It is, as Hans Frei would say, for John Donne, it is the narrated and narratable world. And so he can just assume, and it is the only reality. So instead of trying to, as we generally do, pick something out of the biblical text and find the application to our situation, Donne's, the whole movement of the sermon is to bring us into that story and just move around in it. As I said, he dies in 1631. A few months before his death, John Tillotson, who would become Dean of St. Paul's later in the century, is born. And when he is preaching 40, say, years after Donne's death from that same pulpit, for him, his approach to the text would be very familiar to us. He picks out, so that he considers preaching and Christian faith altogether as being reasonable discourse amongst reasonable people. And so he's picking things out of the text and, as I said earlier, applying them to our lives as sort of moral guidance, moral precepts. And I would say, on the whole, Tillotson won the day, and that's how we mostly preach to this day. Certainly in his own time, each of them was the best known preacher in their time. But this is what Hans Frei calls that shift from being inside the biblical text to taking pieces out of it, or from another perspective, from the perspective of historical scholarship, looking at the text and saying, well, is it true? How much of it is true? In what sense is it true? The impulse that leads to modern criticism of the Bible. Those are just questions that would never occur to Donne, because it is the reality in which he lives and moves and has his being.
And so how does Frei come down on this? How does he judge this shift that he reflects on?
He doesn't like it. His famous book about this is called The Eclipse of the Biblical Narrative. So he feels that the narrative has been just that, eclipsed. And then, now Frei is himself he describes himself as an historian. He's not an historian and a theologian. He's not, in the first instance, a biblical scholar, nor a preacher. But he's making us aware of this change and just beginning to sort of point in directions to how we might view it differently. And I suppose the place he does most of that is in his book, The Identity of Jesus Christ. And he has about 3 exegetical chapters in there, in which he deals with the life of Christ. But as I say, he's not, he doesn't give us a lot of specific examples. But interestingly, several people, including my colleague Stanley Hauer-Wass, and another of my colleagues, Chuck Campbell, both of them respond to Hans Frei's work. Stanley does it by publishing one of his sermons in response to Frei, and then sort of putting a frame around it, saying we can't talk about the church unless we talk the way we talk in the church, which is preaching. And Charles Campbell has written a probably the most extensive study of Frei's work from the perspective of homiletics. And he ends that work, this fits in with some of your own work, he ends that by looking at Walter Brueggemann's post-liberal preaching. And I would say that Walter, I think Chuck Campbell's instinct is right. I think that Walter does, while he has vast learning of historical criticism, when he preaches and when he does most of his writing, he just takes us inside the text.
Walter does. Yeah.
And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that Hans Frei would endorse, although he himself does not speak much about preaching. It was interesting. He was an ordained Baptist. He must have preached quite a lot, and eventually an ordained Episcopal priest.
Speaking of Brueggemann, you had this, you picked out this little piece. It's on page, and I think it's the 3rd or 4th page of the essay, under the subheading, Viewing the Eclipse from the Pulpit. Frei viewed the modern decline of Protestantism as due in part to a failure in imagination. For Christianity cannot exist as a strong force without providing food for the imaginative life. But he's concerned that there must also be this moral element to it. And can you say more about how he held this together, or how he held them in tension? And where might a Brueggemann fall into that, or yourself, or Bard, or?
Sure. I think Frei's concern is that, well, he goes on to say that when imagination and the moral sense pull apart, and imagination responds to the Word of God as a work of art, rather than a challenge for decision and conformity of life, the presence of Christ becomes distorted into an aesthetic thing. I did not read that essay, this book, in Hans Frei's lifetime, but I suspect that some of that concern for a focus on aesthetics divorced from the moral force of the text, that may in part come from his experience as an Episcopal priest. And where often the text is just not taken very seriously. And I would say, this is me, not Hans Frei, I've often contrasted the notion of a strong moral sense, as he does put it, with a moralistic reading of scripture. And in trying to find the little moral with which, trying to find the lesson in the text. And I would say that a bang-up example of that kind of moralism, to which some of my students drew my attention in recent weeks, is Veggie Tales. In which they end with just the little, the moral truth.
Right.
I was asked to respond to the Veggie Tale version of David and Bathsheba and the confrontation Nathan with, and Nathan was a cucumber, a Brussels sprout or something, I don't know what he was. But the lesson at the end was, be kind.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, that is a ridiculous way, conclusion to draw from the story of David, Bathsheba, and Nathan. But it's that sort of moralistic impulse, which almost invariably, well, it turns biblical narrative into Aesop's fables.
Yeah.
Or
So,
worse.
Ellen, I have this question. It's tangential, but I grew up a Mennonite and more of went to Wheaton College and came into the study of theology really through Brueggemann. And I have to say, I'm amazed at, I think, the perception that evangelicals have of the kind of work that you and others are doing, that somehow it's not orthodox, or not saying you in particular, but the characters that I'm running into in this work, and their high view of the biblical text, I think as evangelicals, many evangelicals just simply don't understand, nor do we have as high a view of the text as so many of you do. And I'm surprised by that. So when you mentioned VeggieTales, you're right. I mean, that's kind of evangelicalism these days, is we say we take a high view of scripture and then we do VeggieTales. And so why is there this lack of understanding between, the work that, Brueggemann was rarely invited into evangelical circles. I don't know about Bart or others, but and yourself, but there is this divide that exists.
Well, I'll say that I have been heartened in the last several years to have been invited now. Before COVID, I think 2 years, the 2 immediately preceding years in a row, I was invited as a guest to speak at the Evangelical Theological Society.
Okay.
And that was a new experience
Yeah.
for me. And this is not to my credit, I'm not even sure I had much idea that it existed, that it was thousands of biblical theologians and biblical scholars. So I found that really edifying. And I think people, they didn't invite me as an object lesson of what not to do. I think they were okay with that. And in fact, there was one occasion when 2 young, both American scholars, but trained at Cambridge. So, they had some sense of evangelicalism on 2 different continents. And at the end of the conference, they addressed the room and said, we invited Ellen Davis here because when we read her work, we get excited about being biblical scholars.
Yeah.
Would you tell us what excites you about being biblical scholars? I thought that was a very direct challenge from one generation to an older generation. So, and I have noticed that sometimes when I'm in conversation with evangelical scholars, I am surprised, and I think you were sort of gesturing in this direction. I'm surprised that the details of the text don't always figure as prominently as I would have expected them to. And maybe I understand that a little bit better now, having taught at Duke, because we have such a wide range of people here. And I remember one of my students, she was a Baptist, sang, Black Baptist, saying, I hate it now when my pastor preaches out of the Old Testament. And this is at the end of a year of study with me. And I thought, oh, gee, you know, and she said, because I know exactly what he's going to say. And now I know how many other things he might have said. So again, I mean, these are criticisms from within the community, from younger people. And it actually gives me hope. That, and on the other side, I don't belong to the evangelical community. I'm an Episcopalian, but certainly the kinds of dismissals. Well, I mentioned, you know, an aesthetic dismissal of the text is very common, or just simply rank ignorance of it would be more the problem within my part of the church.
Yeah. Ellen, we're going to wrap up here in a few minutes. What else are you working on, and what's important to you these days as you look at the church and the living people of God and what is needed?
I am just in the process of finishing something that has occupied me for several years, maybe two, sort of hard, and that is a translation of the Psalms for a new hymnal that Duke University Chapel is putting out for the university centenary in 23-24. And I had been asked by a press to think about doing a translation of the Psalms a few years ago, and I wasn't interested. Robert Alter is my teacher. I was very satisfied, you know, on the whole, with what he did with his translation of the Psalms. So I didn't intend to do it. But then when my own church, I go to Duke Chapel, asked me to translate it for this hymnal, which is to say, for the context of worship, that was a very different kind of ask. And I found that, in fact, I did think that there was a gap that needed to be filled in terms of translating the Psalms in a way that, well, frankly, sings, you know, that can be chanted. And in the 21st century, and yet still has the gravitas of the Psalms, you know, and the beauty of it. So that's occupied me, as I say, for a couple of years, doing that with two deeply trained musicians, one of whom also is very well trained in Hebrew, because it's not something I could have done by myself.
I was going to ask you, is music also one of your fortes that I didn't know?
No, I mean, I know enough. I'm an Episcopalian, you know, trained in seminary, and often teaching in a seminary with a lot of Episcopal students. So I have a sort of survival knowledge of liturgical music. I can function in it, but I don't have any deep knowledge. And so that has been really fascinating, just to work with Zeb Heiben, a wonderful choir director, who really hears the rhythms of the text, and it's been great. The other thing I'm working on related to that is also on the Psalms. For 5 or 6 years, I've been working with the painter Makoto Fujimura. He paints the Psalms. I've been supporting him with translations of those, which is how I got into the project. And we are we're working now on a book with his paintings and my translations and essays, in conversation with each other about that.
What wonderfully creative and artistic ways of looking at biblical text and coming to it, Ellen.
It's a treat at this time of life.
Yeah. Ellen, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
It's always delightful to talk with you.
It's been a
And
pleasure.
thank you, and may you have blessing in your efforts. And again, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Conrad. Bye.
Bye-bye.